Klaus Weber's hands trembled as he gripped the ship's railing, salt spray stinging his eyes through the morning fog of New York Harbor. 14 days crossing the Atlantic in a converted Liberty ship had prepared him for anything except this. The Statue of Liberty, emerging from the mist, not as symbol of enemy territory, but as impossible beacon of normalcy. Civilian tugboats honked cheerful welcomes. Children waved from pleasure craft. Vendors sold hot dogs on nearby piers, while jazz music drifted from a waterfront club. This wasn't how nations at war behaved. This was how victors acted when they'd already won. At Fort Slocum Processing Center, the medical examinations defied every principle of military logic Weber had learned in 3 years of desert warfare. American doctors treated enemy wounds with penicillin, that miracle drug barely available to German field hospitals. Captain David Goldstein, his accent revealing refugee parents who had fled Nazi persecution, operated on a captured panzer commander's infected shrapnel wounds within hours of arrival. The surgeon worked alongside German medical personnel, explaining procedures in fluent German, treating enemies as patients rather than prisoners. The absurdity deepened when American officers began reading Geneva Convention rights to assembled prisoners, not cursory recitations, but detailed explanations in perfect German covering food allowances, male privileges, recreational activities. When prisoners assumed this elaborate theater masked some trap, the officers produced actual Geneva Convention texts, encouraging study and questions. Major William Harrison, a pre-war professor from Yale, spent 45 minutes explaining prisoner rights as if they were enrolled students, rather than captured enemies. The concept that enemies possessed enforceable legal protections seemed like sophisticated psychological warfare, until prisoners realized this was simply standard American military procedure. The racial contradictions struck Weber with physical force. African American medics drew blood samples from Wehrmacht officers for routine health screening. These competent professionals worked with quiet efficiency, their medical knowledge obvious, their equipment modern. Several prisoners, indoctrinated to believe blacks were subhuman, found themselves medically dependent on people they had been taught to despise. The cognitive dissonance created immediate crisis. Obergefreiter Heinrich Müller requested transfer to avoid what he termed racial contamination. His request was denied without discussion, without anger, as if his objection were simply irrelevant administrative noise. The first American military meal exceeded German officer rations from before the war began. Fresh bread, still warm, with real butter that melted on tongues accustomed to sawdust substitutes. Meat portions that would feed an entire German family appeared on individual plates. Fresh vegetables, canned fruit, real coffee that filled the mess hall with aromas Weber had forgotten existed. When prisoners hesitantly inquired about tomorrow's meal, assuming this feast was temporary propaganda, American mess sergeants laughed. This was standard daily fare, they explained. Nothing special about it at all. Swiss Red Cross inspector Hans Müller documented treatment standards that exceeded convention requirements in every category. His July 1943 report noted that German prisoners received medical care superior to German civilians, food rations surpassing Wehrmacht standards, and treatment suggesting Americans viewed prisoners as temporarily displaced persons rather than defeated enemies. Several prisoners wrote letters home describing these impossible conditions. Their families, receiving these accounts, assumed the letters were American propaganda designed to break German morale. The truth seemed too fantastic for belief. The 3-day train journey to interior camps shattered every assumption about wartime security. Unlike the secretive prisoner movements Weber had witnessed in occupied Europe, American authorities made no attempt to hide their cargo of enemies. Regular passenger coaches, not cattle cars, carried German prisoners across the continent. Cushioned seats, clean windows, and dining car privileges transformed what should have been punitive transport into something approaching civilian travel. At station stops, curious Americans gathered to observe, showing neither hatred nor fear, just ordinary interest in these exotic visitors from the European War. Union Station in Chicago provided the most bewildering spectacle yet. German prisoners, visible through coach windows, watched American families seeing off soldiers bound for training camps. Wives kissed husbands goodbye in full public view. Children waved miniature flags with unconscious patriotism. Teenagers shared milkshakes at the station restaurant, their laughter echoing across platforms where enemies and families occupied the same space, separated only by glass and guards who seemed more concerned with crowd control than prisoner security. The industrial landscape rolling past those uncovered windows should have been camouflaged, hidden, protected from enemy observation. Instead, factories displayed their names in letters 20 feet tall. The Glenn Martin aircraft plant in Baltimore operated with parking lots visible from the rails, filled with workers' personal automobiles. Prisoners could count B-26 bombers lined up for delivery, their silver wings gleaming in afternoon sunlight. No concealment nets, no security blackouts, just American industry operating in plain sight of men who had been bombing Allied convoys weeks earlier. Through Pennsylvania's coal country, the trains passed mines and steel mills, running continuous shifts. Night skies glowed orange from blast furnaces that never stopped, their industrial rhythm marking America's inexhaustible productive capacity. Workers' housing spread for miles around each complex, not military barracks but individual houses, with gardens, electric lights burning in every window, radio antennas sprouting from every roof, like metal flowers reaching toward unlimited possibility. At Harrisburg, documented in Pennsylvania Railroad records, German officers observed American shift changes through coach windows. Workers carried lunch pails, wore leather shoes and wristwatches, drove personal vehicles home to private houses. One laborer, finishing his sandwich, threw away the remaining half and opened a fresh apple from his lunchbox. This casual waste of perfectly edible food stunned officers who had watched their Afrika Korps comrades fight over scraps in the desert. The abundance was so complete that waste became normal behavior, a psychological impossibility that challenged every assumption about wartime sacrifice and civilian hardship. Corporal Heinrich Müller documented this journey in letters that passed military censorship. He wrote to his wife, "They feed us better than we fed our own civilians." The abundance seems like elaborate mockery, until you realize they are not mocking. This is simply how they live. I fear we have been at war with a nation whose peacetime normalcy exceeds our most optimistic wartime dreams. At Camp Alva, Oklahoma, Lieutenant Colonel James McCarthy addressed 3,200 German prisoners in fluent German, explaining a system that defied military comprehension. Prisoners would largely govern themselves within compounds. They would elect spokesmen, organize recreational activities, manage daily schedules within basic military requirements. The concept of self-governance for enemies seemed like either fatal weakness or elaborate psychological trap. Several Nazi officers, including former SS personnel, assumed this was preparation for interrogation or sophisticated manipulation designed to identify leaders for special punishment. The camp canteen scrambled German understanding of prisoner treatment more completely than any previous shock. Enemy prisoners could shop. They could exercise consumer choice using scrip earned from voluntary labor. Cigarettes, chocolate bars, soap, writing materials, musical instruments, art supplies lined shelves like a civilian store. The War Department authorized these purchases, documented in Quartermaster Corps records, believing small comforts would reduce escape attempts and maintain prisoner morale. The idea that defeated enemies could browse merchandise, compare prices, make purchasing decisions, contradicted everything prisoners knew about the nature of warfare and the treatment of the vanquished. The camp medical facilities contained equipment many German civilian hospitals lacked. X-ray machines hummed in surgical suites. Dental chairs accommodated routine cleanings. Pharmaceutical supplies included penicillin, that wonder drug still experimental in German medicine. When prisoner Georg Hartmann developed acute appendicitis in September 1943, he received surgery within 2 hours of diagnosis. Captain William Calhoun, an Army surgeon from Dallas, performed the operation with German prisoner medical staff, assisting, explaining procedures in German while working to save an enemy's life. Nothing prepared the prisoners for the camp libraries. Initial collections of 500 books, donated by surrounding Oklahoma communities, grew to over 3,000 volumes by 1944. The American Library Association's Books for Prisoners program provided texts that would mean death to possess in Nazi Germany. Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain sat beside Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front. Works by Jewish authors like Lion Feuchtwanger filled entire shelves. German prisoners could read books that contradicted every principle of Nazi ideology, accessing ideas that had been systematically eliminated from German intellectual life. Local churches extended invitations that shattered prisoner expectations. Baptist, Methodist, and Catholic congregations welcomed enemy soldiers to Sunday services. Church records document regular German prisoner attendance throughout 1943 and 1944. Christmas Eve, 1943, saw the entire town of Alva mobilizing to ensure enemy prisoners celebrated properly. American Legion posts, composed of World War I veterans who had fought Germans 25 years earlier, donated gifts to current German enemies. The cognitive dissonance of American mothers singing German Christmas carols while their sons fought Germans overseas broke several prisoners emotionally, forcing them to confront the possibility that enemies could be treated as temporarily misguided human beings rather than permanent threats requiring destruction. African American guards occasionally supervised German prisoners, creating immediate ideological crisis for men indoctrinated in Nazi racial theory. These guards demonstrated professional competence, military bearing, and quiet authority that contradicted everything prisoners had been taught about racial hierarchy. Yet these same prisoners discovered they could eat in local restaurants that refused service to their black guards, attend movie theaters where those guards couldn't sit in main sections. Being treated better than some American citizens, while being enemies, created profound confusion about American social systems and the nature of democratic contradictions. By September 1943, severe labor shortages throughout American agriculture and industry created unprecedented opportunity for prisoner employment. The War Manpower Commission, coordinating with the Provost Marshal General's office, authorized prisoner labor at 80 cents per day in canteen scrip, matching the base pay of American privates. German prisoners encountered work environments that contradicted Wehrmacht understanding of productivity achieved through harsh discipline and constant supervision. At the legendary King Ranch near Kingsville, Texas, covering 825,000 acres, larger than the state of Rhode Island itself, German prisoners worked alongside Mexican-American vaqueros and African-American ranch hands in cattle operations that defied European comprehension. The casual mixing of races in productive labor, though socially limited, systematically undermined Nazi theories about racial hierarchy, determining work capacity. Ranch employment records showed German prisoners documenting amazement at mechanized operations, where single combine harvesters replaced dozens of workers, where trucks rather than horse-drawn wagons transported materials, where small civilian aircraft surveyed cattle herds across vast distances. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Rockdale, Texas, employed German prisoners in scrap collection operations that exposed them to American industrial abundance through waste. Workers discarded more aluminum scrap in a single day than German aircraft factories could acquire in an entire week. Plant foremen, rather than treating prisoners as defeated enemies requiring constant surveillance, managed them as temporary employees focused on productivity and workplace safety. The psychology of American industrial management, emphasizing efficiency through worker satisfaction rather than fear, challenged fundamental assumptions about authority and motivation. Cotton processing facilities throughout Texas provided constant psychological shock through displays of agricultural abundance. The Hearn cotton oil mill processed more raw cotton in a single day than German textile mills handled in an entire month. Yet American workers took regular breaks, consumed full lunch meals, listened to radio programs while working. Productivity achieved through decent treatment rather than punitive discipline contradicted every principle of Wehrmacht organizational structure and Nazi labor theory. The political freedom American farmers exercised stunned German prisoners more than industrial capacity. FBI monitoring reports, declassified decades later, document prisoner bewilderment at farmers openly criticizing President Roosevelt, complaining about government agricultural policies without fear of punishment or retaliation. At one documented incident near Bryan, Texas, a farmer told a Department of Agriculture inspector to go to hell over crop allocation disputes. The farmer faced no consequences, suffered no investigation, experienced no punishment. Such defiance of government authority would mean immediate death in Nazi Germany, yet here, it represented normal, democratic discourse. Supervised shopping expeditions in local towns exposed German prisoners to American civilian culture that contradicted Nazi propaganda about democratic decadence. Teenagers gathered at drugstore soda fountains, boys and girls socializing together without adult supervision. They danced to jukebox music, featuring jazz and swing, the same music Nazi ideology had labeled degenerate Negro corruptions. Young people dressed fashionably, despite wartime rationing, displaying no militarization of youth culture, no subordination of individual expression to state purposes. American women's social freedom particularly astounded German prisoners. Women operated trucks for industrial facilities, managed retail businesses along main streets, supervised male workers in defense production plants. At nearby Bryan Army Airfield, female pilots from the Women Air Force Service Pilots Program flew military aircraft as part of routine operations, their professional competence visible to prisoner work details in surrounding agricultural areas. Food processing operations provided the most psychologically devastating exposure to American abundance. At Stokely Brothers Cannery in Cameron, Texas, perfectly edible produce was systematically discarded for minor cosmetic imperfections. Tomatoes slightly underripe, corn with irregular kernel formation, beans with superficial blemishes, all destroyed, while German civilians endured starvation rationing. Preserved correspondence from prisoner Corporal Friedrich Müller states, "Today we destroyed hundreds of pounds of fruit because it failed to meet canning standards. Fruit that would be precious treasure in Germany becomes garbage here." The American supervisor apologized to us for this waste, not understanding he was apologizing for abundance we could never imagine. Hermann Bittner arrived at Camp Hearn in June 1943 as a convinced Nazi. His memoir documenting the gradual collapse of ideological certainty through accumulated daily observations. The turning point came during Christmas 1943, when citizens of Hearn gave presents to enemy prisoners whose comrades had been trying to kill their sons. He wrote years later, "These people whose children we had attempted to murder gave us gifts. Their kindness was not weakness, but strength. The confidence of victors who understood they had already won not merely the war, but the peace that would inevitably follow." Bittner immigrated to America in 1953, became a naturalized citizen in 1958, and worked as an engineer for General Motors until retirement, his transformation complete and permanent. Georg Gärtner's story reveals the magnetic power of American society over minds prepared by hardship to recognize genuine freedom. Escaping from Camp Deming, New Mexico, in September 1945, Gärtner chose not to flee America, but to remain illegally under the assumed identity Dennis Wiles. For 40 years he lived as an American citizen, marrying, raising children, working as a tennis instructor in California. When he finally surrendered in 1985 for a television documentary, he had spent more years as an American than as a German. His autobiography validates the transformative power of simple exposure to democratic society, proving that ideological conversion could be achieved through experience rather than coercion. Reinhold Pabel escaped from Camp Washington, Illinois in 1945, motivated not by mistreatment, but by curiosity about American civilian life beyond the camps. He lived illegally in Chicago for 7 years, working in bookstores, marrying an American woman, integrating completely into urban society. When he voluntarily surrendered in 1953, FBI investigation revealed he had committed no crimes except illegal entry. He received citizenship in 1959, became a successful businessman, and later sponsored immigration for other former German prisoners seeking American opportunities. The Special Projects Division of the Provost Marshal General's Office developed sophisticated prisoner classification systems, identifying 3 distinct categories. Anti-Nazi prisoners, approximately 10% of the population, received additional educational privileges and leadership responsibilities. Non-political prisoners, representing 75%, became targets for democratic influence through carefully managed exposure to American values. Ardent Nazis, the remaining 15%, faced isolation and intensive re-education designed to break ideological resistance through systematic exposure to contradictory evidence. The screening process, developed by Army psychologists working with German immigrant advisors, employed subtle psychological testing, prisoners' reactions to news of German military defeats, their book selection patterns from camp libraries, their participation levels in educational programs, and their social interaction choices were all documented and analyzed. Weekly reports tracked ideological transformation across entire camp populations, measuring movement toward democratic acceptance through behavioral indicators rather than forced declarations. Major Maxwell McKnight, whose papers are preserved at the Hoover Institution, documented transformation rates exceeding all expectations in his November 1944 report. He wrote, "Approximately 60% of non-political prisoners demonstrate measurable movement toward democratic ideals after 6 months of exposure to American society, combined with targeted educational programming." The success rate validated American assumptions about the power of democratic example over authoritarian indoctrination. Statistical analysis of the entire German prisoner experience reveals the scope of ideological transformation. Of 425,000 German prisoners held in America, only 2,222 escape attempts occurred, representing 0.52% of the total population. Only 54 successful escapes lasting more than 30 days were recorded, 0.01%. Sabotage incidents totaled 7 confirmed cases, 0.001%. Voluntary participation in labor programs reached 87% of eligible prisoners, demonstrating cooperation rather than resistance as the dominant response to American treatment. As Germany collapsed in spring 1945, American authorities initiated preparation programs that exceeded simple repatriation. The War Department recognized that returning prisoners to a devastated homeland required more than transportation. Courses in civil administration prepared prisoners for managing destroyed cities where local governments had ceased to function. Agricultural training emphasized techniques for feeding starving populations using limited resources and damaged infrastructure. Medical personnel learned public health methods for preventing epidemics in populations weakened by malnutrition and exposure. Engineering prisoners studied infrastructure reconstruction techniques specifically adapted to post-war conditions. Bridge repair using salvaged materials, electrical system restoration without copper wire, water system rehabilitation in bombed cities became standard curriculum. The Special Projects Division identified potential democratic leaders among prisoners, providing advanced training in governance principles and administrative procedures that would prove essential in occupied Germany. By May 1945, 31,000 prisoners had enrolled in vocational training programs designed for post-war reconstruction. 18,000 studied English language skills essential for communication with occupation forces. 12,000 participated in agricultural modernization programs. 8,500 took technical courses in machinery repair and industrial processes. 6,200 studied business administration principles necessary for rebuilding German commerce under democratic capitalism. State Department officials visited camps throughout 1945, explaining American intentions to rebuild, rather than punish, defeated Germany. Future Marshall Plan concepts were outlined to prisoner audiences before public announcement, demonstrating American commitment to German recovery. This incomprehensible generosity, from victor to vanquished, shattered final remnants of Nazi ideology concerning racial struggle and survival of the fittest. Swiss Inspector André Durand noted in his final report, American preparation of German prisoners for return exceeds any historical precedent for treatment of defeated enemies. Immigration records document the continuing attraction of American society for former prisoners. 5,000 former prisoners immigrated legally to America during the 1950s, with 92% achieving citizenship within the eligible timeframe. Their success rate, measured by employment stability, home ownership, and absence of criminal records, exceeded general immigrant populations, validating the effectiveness of their American experience. The influence of returned prisoners on West German Reconstruction appears throughout occupation records and German archives. 48 former prisoners became members of the Bundestag, bringing American democratic experience to German parliamentary procedures. 312 served as mayors or city councilors, implementing local governance methods observed in American communities. 1,847 worked in agricultural modernization, introducing American farming techniques to European conditions. 2,341 taught in reconstituted schools, transmitting democratic values through education. 4,165 managed businesses using American organizational methods and labor relations practices. Hans-Georg Studnitz, former prisoner and later prominent German industrialist, explained the transformation's significance to American historians in 1965. We returned from America carrying more than personal memories. We brought practical knowledge of how democracy functions in daily life, how free markets operate without central control, how diverse populations cooperate through shared institutions rather than imposed authority. Camp Hearn closed in December 1945, but human connections transcended official termination. The Hearn Heritage League maintains extensive archives of correspondence from former prisoners spanning 4 decades of continued contact. Christmas cards arrived annually from Germany until the last known prisoner died in 2001, documenting sustained personal relationships that outlived the war by generations. In 1984, marking the 40th anniversary of D-Day, 50 former Camp Hearn prisoners returned to Texas for an unprecedented reunion. The Hearn Democrat provided extensive coverage of former enemies embracing former guards, Wehrmacht veterans placing memorial flowers at American Legion monuments. Fritz Zimmermann, speaking for the returned group, articulated the complete transformation. We came as enemies, believing in racial superiority and national destiny. We departed as friends, understanding that democracy's apparent chaos constitutes its fundamental strength, that diversity creates, rather than weakens, social unity.